Here are two very complicated questions. How wealthy is your country? And how happy is your country? In the past, economists thought these questions were closely connected. For example, consider the words of Adam Smith, one of the most famous economists of all time. In the 1700s, Smith wrote his most famous book called The Wealth of Nations, and it's all about the processes of making money. However, Smith was also concerned with making happiness. Surprisingly, he actually thought happiness was the more important of the two. He wrote that governments should, and I quote, "promote the happiness of those who live under them. This is their sole end and use." Gradually, this softer side of economics seemed to get lost. Governments became content to measure the progress of their countries by financial figures alone. For example, since the 1930s, governments have paid close attention to something called gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, or GDP for short, basically says how much money a country is making. If the GDP goes up, the economy is growing. GDP is popular with governments for good reasons. For instance, although it takes a lot of time and effort to gather all the information required, GDP is easy to measure, mathematically speaking. It's also an easy way to compare different countries. However, people are generally much richer than they were in the 1930s. Does this mean they are happier? Daniel Gilbert, psychology professor at Harvard University and happiness expert, says no. According to Gilbert, unless people are very poor, a lot more money doesn't lead to a lot more happiness. So, is it possible for a government to measure happiness? As early as 2008, the tiny mountain country of Bhutan replaced GDP with gross national happiness. Bhutan's government measures success via data on, among other things, education levels, life expectancy, well-being, and environmental diversity. Bhutan may have only 800,000 inhabitants, but gradually these ideas have gained popularity around the world. The United Nations published its first World Happiness Report in 2012. The UN's ambition in these reports is huge. It collects data in over 150 countries and asks large numbers of people to complete a questionnaire. The participants answer questions using a so-called Cantril ladder, where 0 is the answer for the worst possible life and 10 is the answer for the best possible life. Over time, the UN's World Happiness Reports make very interesting reading. 4 countries, Denmark, Switzerland, Norway, and Finland, have been in the top 10 for the last 5 reports. Commentators have suggested this is because these countries have high taxes and governments very focused on delivering well-being to their citizens. But wait a minute. Are questionnaires a good way to measure happiness? Some critics point out that the questions in the survey may be culturally biased, meaning that people of different nationalities do not answer in the same way. For example, in Japan and other Asian countries, it is not polite to say that you are doing very well. This is seen as boasting. So, if people around the world feel differently about happiness, how can we compare the results? Indeed, different happiness reports tend to have widely different results. In the UN's 2019 report, Luxembourg in Europe does very well. It comes 14th out of 159 countries. Now consider the Happy Planet Index, which uses similar measures to the UN but adds in one key element: environmental impact. Remember, this was a feature of Bhutan's original idea for measuring happiness. Like Bhutan, Luxembourg is a comparatively small country, but unlike most countries, Luxembourg has cheap gas. Not only does this lead to one of the highest rates of car usage in the world, it has also created something called fuel tourism. People drive into Luxembourg from other countries in order to buy gas, and then they drive out again. The Happy Planet Index places Luxembourg 139th out of 140 countries, arguing that its failure in the environmental category outranks its good scores elsewhere. In conclusion, although happiness reports are still relatively new, they have many problems. I wonder how Adam Smith would solve these issues.